Hello, welcome to the first episode of my new podcast called Jam Sesh, where I talk about alternative music and what it means to be an artist. So, today I wanted to talk about something I read in one of my favorite books, Heavier Than Heaven, a biography of Kurt Cobain. So, I wanted to go over some things I read in the intro or the preface. So this book came out in 2001, but the edition I have is the updated and expanded edition, which came out in 2019. So this is the preface that the author, Charles R. Cross, wrote in 2019. And I thought there were some interesting points he made. Some I agreed with, some I disagreed with, and some I don't know how I feel about, and could potentially lead to an interesting discussion about art and music. So something interesting that he says here is when Kurt wasn't touring, he was recording on cassette and putting postage stamps on demo tapes he sent in the mail to record labels, all of which were rejected. Kurt suffered years of bitter struggle, but in the end, these trials were essential to his artistry. If Kurt had come of age 20 years later, and a video of Nirvana's disastrous first ever gig, where Kurt said he didn't know the words to one of Led Zeppelin's most famous songs, had been uploaded for internet viewers to mock or judge, I suspect Kurt's career would have been over before it began. So there are several points that I want to make here. So he says that Kurt, when he was recording on cassette, and he had to put postage stamps on the demos and mail them out, and it was and then it says Kurt suffered years of bitter struggle, but in the end, these trials were essential to his artistry. So basically he's saying that this having to mail all the postage and everything like that contributed to his struggle, and I don't doubt that he struggled, because he did. But it's interesting how he thinks that working on music back in the day when things were more analog, that they were harder. And I don't doubt that they were harder in a lot of ways. But I guess an interesting theme that I've been thinking about is, were things better back in the day or worse back in the day, or just kind of the same, as in certain things became harder, certain things became easier, but overall they kind of balanced each other out. Like, sure, it's tedious to have to record everything on cassette tapes, and you might run out of tape, so you have to be careful not to waste tape, and it's expensive and you have to buy it, and then having to physically mail them out to record labels. Yes, that's tedious, I don't doubt that. And yeah, nowadays you would email or something. I don't exactly know how you would send your songs to record labels. Maybe you upload them online. Can you say that that's more tedious or less tedious? I'm sure there's a lot of tedium in having to send out a bunch of emails as well. It's anyone who has applied for a job. I'm sure we're all kind of sick of keeping up with our email inbox. Is it fair to say that overall things are much easier now because we have technology? Or is it that certain things are easier but other things are now harder? And this is a theme I'll revisit later in the episode. Another thing I wanted to point out was, he says, if Kurt had come of age 20 years later, and a video of Nirvana's disastrous first ever gig, where Kurt said he didn't know the words to one of Led Zeppelin's most famous songs, had been uploaded for internet viewers to mock and judge, I suspect Kurt's career would have been over before it began. So he's basically saying that there was one time where Kurt said he didn't know the lyrics to one of Led Zeppelin's most famous songs, and the author is basically saying that if this happened 20 years later and it had been uploaded to the internet for people to mock and judge, that his career would have been over. I don't know. I mean, I know the author of this book is older and not super in tune with internet culture, and this is I understand, the author of this book is part of an older generation and might not be as in tune with internet culture, but I don't think you would get canceled for just not knowing a famous song. That most people would roast you or troll you for it. But I can't imagine someone getting canceled just for not knowing the lyrics of a song. For example, I remember this one time, like 10 years ago or so, like Justin Bieber, who was really popular at the time, was asked about Shawn Mendes, who was becoming more popular at the time. And Justin Bieber was like, I don't know who that is, which was pretty crazy because Shawn Mendes' music was everywhere at that point. And no one canceled him for that. Like, I don't think it's a big deal for someone famous to not know something, a famous song or artist. I don't think you would be canceled for that. I would argue that it would actually add to Kurt's punk rock credibility, because when you're in the whole punk rock scene, you don't want to be someone who's too much into mainstream culture. You want to be like, cool, alternative, indie, I listen to bands you've never heard of. So I feel like by not knowing a mainstream artist, that would actually enhance his punk rock, or in this case, by Kurt not knowing the most popular Led Zeppelin song, it would actually enhance his punk rock credibility. But I definitely don't think it would have ended his career before it even began. So another thing that he says in the preface that I wanted to talk about was the way that Kurt Cobain's music taste was formed. He argued that Kurt's artistic influences were really limited in happenstance, which was pretty much true for anyone who grew up pre-internet. So it says he was exposed to music from 3 primary sources: what he heard on the radio, what he heard and saw on MTV, and the records he either purchased or was given by his friends. So either radio, MTV, or records. And then he says it was shaped by the randomness of what albums were cheap or whatever thrift stores or garage sales he walked by. He made a mixtape for a friend in the early Nirvana days that contained the hardcore group Red Cross and pop rock from the Bay City Rollers, The Knack, and the Beatles. No Spotify playlist could possibly come up with that algorithm. So basically what he's trying to say here is that Kurt Cobain's music taste was very random and happenstance, and based off of whatever random music he stumbled across. And those specific random musical influences were what influenced his songs that he made for Nirvana. Again, another thing that I would want to argue is the point that the author is making here is that a lot of factors in Kurt's environment allowed him to be exposed, and what the author is basically trying to argue here is that a lot of the things that were in Kurt's environment were very unique, and that's why Nirvana has such a unique sound. And yes, Nirvana does have a unique sound. However, I wonder how unique this whole situation in Kurt's environment was. For example, the randomness of his music taste. He says that the main way Kurt's music taste was influenced was through happenstance, as in radio, MTV, and friends. But is that not similar to how we also find out about new music? Like, yes, we don't listen to the radio and MTV. MTV was before our time, but I listened to the radio a lot in middle school. I think it was around high school where I stopped listening to the radio and started streaming music. But a lot of us Gen Z probably did listen to the radio when we were kids, and millennials definitely would have. And yes, MTV was before our time. But what kind of music is on the radio and MTV? Mainstream music. And Gen Z still is exposed to mainstream music, just in a different way. Yeah, we don't listen to the radio or watch MTV, but nowadays the way mainstream music is distributed is through TikTok and other sort of social media like that. And you can tell a song has become really popular when you'll hear it in the background of lots of random TikToks, or in general, if you see people using it in their short form content. That's how I know, okay, I guess this song is really popular now. So while it's not the exact same thing, it's kind of an evolved version of that. While yes, he was exposed to the radio and MTV, we still have our equivalent of that, which maybe is TikTok for right now, and then in the future it'll be something different, because the way mainstream music is distributed does change over time. As for the friends thing, I'm sure all of us have influenced our friends' music in some way or been influenced at some point in our lives. Especially the way the Spotify app is set up, it's designed around music sharing, and there is a social component to it as well. So when you think about it, I don't know how random his music taste truly is. because it was either influenced by the mainstream through the radio or MTV, or by his friends, which, yes, does have an element of randomness, but at the same time, how different are your friends from you? There is a bit of selection bias there. We tend to be friends with people who are in some way similar to us, either in age or socioeconomic status or education levels or career or personality interests. If you don't have anything in common with someone, you probably wouldn't be their friend. So even then, it's still not completely random. So I guess I would want to challenge the idea of how unique and happenstance Kurt Cobain's music taste was. Because I don't disagree that Nirvana had a really unique sound for the time, and I don't disagree that Kurt Cobain's artistry was unique, but I guess I'm wondering which specific factors contributed to that. So yeah, it says here, no Spotify playlist could possibly come up with that algorithm. It just doesn't make sense. But then in some ways it makes perfect sense if you listen to the music of Nirvana. So again, he says no Spotify playlist could possibly come up with that algorithm. I'm confused what he means by that, because the pre-made playlists that exist on streaming platforms are either geared around a specific genre or artist, or so you wouldn't expect a pre-made playlist to be random because they're all based on a specific theme. But even then, I would argue that it leads to more randomness, because I have found all sorts of artists that I would have never encountered if it weren't for the pre-made playlist. I use Apple Music, and they have a lot of pre-made playlists like IMD's rock or skateboarding or pop punk or whatever. And because a lot of those are genres I listen to a lot, I do tend to know quite a few of the songs, but then once in a while I'll discover a song or album or band that I've never heard of before, and I don't know if I ever would have discovered if I hadn't listened to this playlist. That's also completely random and happenstance, just like how it would be if you walked into a record store and saw a cool looking record and listened to it and you're like, that's cool, I like that. It's the same kind of thing, just digital. It's easier to discover new music now than it ever has been. I mean, before you were limited by your physical location, and first of all, you needed money. If you wanted a record, you had to be able to afford one. Not only that, but there had to be a record store in your town that had that record. If it were a really niche record that wasn't as popular, and you lived in a small town, it's possible you might not even be able to have access to it or even know about it in the first place. If you couldn't get it in a physical store, then you just couldn't get it at all. In fact, I think people's music taste nowadays is way more random than it used to be, because like the author says, the main way you could discover music is the radio, MTV, and then through friends or record stores. So that's a very limited pool of music. Both the radio and MTV primarily play mainstream music, and record stores also primarily carry a lot of mainstream music and then some less mainstream music. But if you wanted something really niche, it would be hard to, one, find out about it, and two, actually find it in the store. Whereas nowadays, I feel like people can discover music in all sorts of avenues, like pre-made playlists on streaming services, or it's a lot easier to share music with friends. There's a lot of websites out there where you can search for like a specific song or genre, or you hear a song in the background of some social media content and you're like, that's a good song, what is that? I feel like there's a lot more potential for randomness because we're exposed to a lot more content now and a lot more music now. A lot more music is being made and a lot more music exists, and we have more exposure to it. So we're able to cover a greater music and culture surface area, which increases the likelihood for randomness. So I would argue that us Gen Z probably have a way more random music taste than previous generations because we have more access to more songs. And it's a lot easier to find something niche than it used to be. I remember when I was a kid and I didn't have free-range internet usage. It was hard for me to discover new music. I was just kind of stuck to whatever was mainstream, whatever I heard on the radio or heard on Disney Channel. I had a Kids Bop CD when I was a kid, so sorry, I don't mean to flex. I was pretty much limited to whatever was popular. There was no way I could discover anything super niche. Now it would be so easy. All I have to do is go in an internet rabbit hole, which I think we all do all the time. You discover one band and that leads to another and another and another, and you're listening to some really niche artist that has like 47 monthly listeners on Spotify. And it's like, wow, I hit the jackpot. I never would have found out about this band if it weren't for my super sleuthing. And this is something I've noticed as I've gotten older. And I don't know if this is a societal thing or just an age thing, but I've noticed people's music taste branching out more. Like when I was a kid, like 10 years ago, I feel like everyone was listening to all the same music, just whatever was mainstream at the time. Whereas nowadays, if I ask people around me what they listen to, no one really listens to mainstream music primarily. Everyone has their own diverse and niche music taste. And a lot of people listen to artists I've never even heard of as well. And again, I don't know if this is an age thing yet. Like I said, as a kid, you don't really go out of your way to find new music. You just kind of listen to what's there. Also, as a kid, you might not have full internet access. I mean, kids nowadays do, but back in my day. But it's possible it could also just be an age thing. Like, as you get older, you kind of become more aware of what your styles and tastes are. You've explored more, so you have a sense of what you like and don't like. So that could also be a possibility of why Gen Z's music taste is so much more diverse than previous. I don't know if it was more diverse than previous generations, because obviously I wasn't part of those generations, but I'm guessing. I would guess that, let's say like Gen X. Let's say I was part of the Gen X generation. Like he says, I can only find out through music in either radio or MTV or record stores. So I would imagine everyone around me is probably listening to all the same stuff because these are the only avenues. But now the internet is this big, limitless thing. You can find out about any song ever. You're not just limited by your physical location. So you can just listen to any song ever. So these are the ideas that were presented to me in this book that I wanted to say some things about, or like these are my immediate reactions to what is said in this preface. And now I wanted to talk about, I guess, what sorts of questions these ideas lead to. I feel like the argument that the author is making in this book is that generally pre-technology things were better, I think, is the vibe. And honestly, with the crazy way technology has become, I'm starting to feel like that's true. But that's a different topic. So I guess what I wanted to ask was, does technology help or hinder individuality? Like, we're exposed to so much content. The amount of music out there, the amount of movies, TV shows, YouTube videos, like just social media content, books even. It's very easy for people to make their own stuff now and release it out into the world. And I think it's beneficial in the fact that we have more options and we can find something that's very specific to our interests. And we're exposed to more worldviews and ideas. But also I feel like we are overstimulated. We don't mull over ideas as much because we could just feed ourselves a new idea. So nothing really sticks in our brain. Like, while we consume more content, I feel like less stuff stays in our brain. And on the other hand, it's like having so much stimulation, isn't that a bit too much influence? Does that impact the way we make decisions? Like, do we even have our own opinions, or do we get our opinions from the internet? Or the other way around, where we're exposed to so many opinions that we can make an informed decision because we have more information. Whereas back then, they had less information, so their opinions were less informed. So is having all this extra information helping or hindering our decision making? Because back in the day, people had less exposure to new ideas or media or content. But also, they had less stimulation, so their brain wasn't constantly overwhelmed, and they were being bored. Back to pre-internet, like nowadays, people are not willing to be bored for even a second. If you see people waiting in line or if someone has to wait for something for more than like 10 seconds, they'll pull out their phone. People are just not willing to be bored anymore, even for a short amount of time. And it has been scientifically proven that boredom does lead to creativity. And I definitely feel like that's true for myself. The only time my brain comes up with unique stuff that I haven't thought before is when I am just bored and not doing anything. Like, that's why shower thoughts are a thing, because it's one of the rare moments in a day where people just stand there and do nothing. Like there's no stimulation. You're just alone with your thoughts, and that's when your thoughts become the most creative, because your brain is able to play around and rearrange things in your brain, which you can't do when you're being fed content. So while I feel like all this extra content leads to more potential for creativity, I don't know if it actually leads to more creativity, because while we have the potential to come up with better ideas since we have more knowledge, we don't actually come up with better ideas because we don't allow ourselves to be bored. And when you think about Kurt Cobain's life, which you would know if you read this, but he was exposed to a lot of boredom, as pretty much everyone from his generation was. I mean, he was from a small town. There was nothing to do. So naturally, what would you do? You pick up a guitar and start playing and start making music. I feel like nowadays a lot of Gen Z doesn't have hobbies and consumes content in their free time. And I'm sure all the boredom he was exposed to definitely impacted his creativity, because when there's nothing to do, your mind wanders. And when your mind wanders, then it goes to interesting places that you never would have expected. Just like when you wander in real life. The whole point of wandering is when you're going somewhere but you don't know where. So that's why if you're an artist, or you just want to be more creative in general, or you want to come up with new, interesting, unique ideas, I think it's really important to just let your mind wander instead of trying to fill up. Another point in regards to the overstimulation due to the internet, I wonder if it makes it harder for us to keep things simple. For example, Kurt Cobain never had technical knowledge on guitar. He took maybe like 1 month of guitar lessons at most. He never officially learned how to play guitar. But that lack of technical knowledge is what helped his music, because Nirvana's music is really unique, and I am going to cover this in future podcast episodes on what makes Nirvana's music so special. Just to say briefly, a big component as to what makes them special is their simplicity. Generally, people have the idea that complicated is better when it comes to music. If there's like some crazy, complicated guitar solo, people are like, whoa, that's so cool. And Nirvana's music was so simple, so easy. When you hear it, it doesn't sound hard to play. All Nirvana songs that I can play on the guitar, I've learned in like 2 days, because they're very easy and anyone can play them. And that's this kind of thing that you can only make if you don't have technical knowledge. Because if you do have technical knowledge, you'll want to use it. You'll want to use your music theory and be like, this chord doesn't go with this. But Kurt, he didn't know that, so he could kind of think out of the box. So I feel like that lack of knowledge can also help you sometimes, because you don't have your preconceived notions. And it's easier to think outside of the box when you don't even really know what the box is. Whereas when you have a lot of knowledge, you're more likely to have tunnel vision and not see what other possibilities there are. And I gave him more of a punk rock vibe as well, because punk rock is all about not following rules. So music that doesn't adhere to the rules of music theory but still sounds good and still conveys intense emotions, that's the most punk rock thing ever. But anyways, that's for a different episode. So now I wanted to talk about, is it easier or harder to be an artist now than it was before? If you can hear that, but my neighbor is doing something in their yard. I don't even know what that is. Anyways, when I'm talking about then versus now, what I mean is pre-internet versus post-internet. So is it easier to be an artist now, or was it easier to be an artist then? So some pros and cons. So the pros for now is we're exposed to more ideas. I already said there are some drawbacks to being exposed to more ideas. But there are also some benefits. I feel like Gen Z is more knowledgeable about more subjects than previous generations, because we have very easy access to more information. And that can help us in our thinking. I think information is power, and with power comes responsibility. So I feel like having the right amount of information, not too much, because then it'll influence you, but knowing when you need to stop learning and start doing, that's where the true artistry lies. So as long as we don't overload ourselves with content, I feel like the amount of information available we can get any information whenever we want. Like, I can just know any information I want, whenever I want, wherever I want. There's nothing I can't know if I wanted to. Another benefit is that now there's more resources, knowledge, and platforms. So okay, the knowledge is similar to the previous idea, but there's also more resources and platforms. Like if someone wanted to publish a book now, you don't need a publisher to approve of your book. You can just self-publish. Same for music. You can make your own music and put it on YouTube. If you were a screenwriter, sure, you can send in your script to a movie studio, or you can produce your own film. We have more agency in that sense. We don't need a big corporation to approve of our work for it to be out there. We can just make it on our own and put our own stuff out there, which also contributes to the previous idea. Because anyone can just make anything, there's so much more out there, and no one's really screening for quality. Now, well, yes, it's easier to find a movie or show to watch or a book to read. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be good. Back then, because there was a higher barrier for entry, there was also a higher barrier for quality. Nowadays, we have so many options, but they're not necessarily better options. You have to weed through a lot of mediocre options to find something good, which can be fatiguing. A lower barrier to entry. Anyone can make anything, so you don't need any sort of fancy degrees or certification or training courses. You don't need a master's degree in writing. You don't need a master's degree in writing to write a book. You don't need to have studied music to make music. You don't need to have gone to film school to write a script. Anyone can learn how to do anything, and anyone can do it and produce it themselves and release it. Lack of knowledge is not really much of an issue anymore. People can be self-taught. Like I taught myself guitar, which I wouldn't have been able to do without the internet. I can learn on my own at home, and I can teach myself at the pace I want. I can learn the songs I want. And it saves money too. I don't have to pay for guitar lessons as well. So another pro is more diversity. Because there's no barrier to entry and anyone can do it, we get more viewpoints. For example, maybe back in the day, to publish a book you had to go to college and maybe get a master's degree and have to network with the right people. Because there was a certain barrier to entry, only sometimes that weeds out certain demographics of people, and not everyone is able to meet those barriers. You might have to have a certain amount of education, or obviously a certain amount of money to pursue that education, or maybe you have to know the right people. And not that that doesn't apply nowadays, but now more things are less off limits. So like I said earlier, before you needed a corporation to approve of you, now you don't. You can just put your own stuff out there. And yes, I know, like even when you put your own stuff out there, you still need a corporation. Like YouTube is still a corporation, or you could self-publish through Amazon, still a corporation. But they're not going to turn you down because they need more content, because they make more money. So it becomes a mutually beneficial relationship. And corporations do have to think about money. If they think your story is not going to make the money, they'll turn you away, which leads to only certain types of stories being told. Whereas if you can put your own story out there, no one can tell you that you can't. And that does lead to more diversity in thought, in which I mentioned in my previous point. So yeah, there's more opportunity for independent and freelance artists out there who don't want to belong to a certain company, which leads to less monopoly. So now there's more potential for there to be smaller studios instead of big conglomerate mega studios that kind of control and own everything. So I feel like there's less monopoly in art. Another benefit is more people can access it because nowadays you don't have to pay for a lot of things if you don't want to. You can just watch ads and get them for free. So it makes it more democratized, as in more people can create art, more people can put it out in the world, and more people can access it as well. Back in the day, you had to pay for music. That was not an option to get it for free. Nowadays, you can get it for free if you are willing to watch some ads. And even now, even if you have a subscription to a streaming service, you're just paying one flat fee a month, and you can listen to as many songs as you want. Whereas back in the day, you're limited to the physical albums you had. If you wanted to listen to something different, you had to go out and buy that. So even now, if you're paying for it, you still get the better deal because you don't have to pay more for listening to more music. You pay the same amount to listen to how much ever you want. And as a result, art is not exclusive for only the upper class to the extent that it used to be, now that more people can access it and make it. So these are some of the benefits, but there are also some downsides to being an artist nowadays, and some of these pros can also be cons as well. So a con would be there's too much stimulation / influence, which I already mentioned. But like I said, too much influence can impact our decision making, and being informed can influence our decision making. Having too many ideas can confuse us or paralyze us as well. And again, I do wonder, and I don't know the answer to this, but I wonder, is our decision making better or worse now that we have more information? Could be better because we know more stuff, but it also could be worse because we might not be thinking as independently as we might like because we're surrounded by so many opinions. And the next point is, and I mentioned this earlier, but we don't feel bored anymore. And boredom leads to creativity. The fact that a lot of us are not willing to be bored, that does hinder our ability to be creative. And then also we have a shorter attention span. This is not new. I mean, this is one of the big topics everyone is talking about, but we're so used to having things so quickly and delivered to us in such efficient ways that now we don't want to wait for anything. And sometimes good art takes time. It takes time both creation-wise and experiencing-wise. For example, have you noticed that movies these days are a lot more fast-paced than they used to be? And I know they do that because they want to keep our attention, because people's attention spans are much shorter. But honestly, I feel like it hinders the quality of the movie. I at least don't take a movie as seriously when they go too fast. I take a movie more seriously when it's slow. And yes, sometimes I do get bored, but I also respect it more as an art form. Sometimes a book is so complex that it takes you multiple rereads to understand and appreciate it. So I feel like our short attention spans definitely hinders our ability to appreciate good art. And then the next one, I don't know if this is a pro or a con, but there's a lot of self-promotion now. Back in the day, you would just sign with a company, they would promote your work. Now, if you're putting out your own work, you have to promote your own music. Now, musicians have to make TikToks that promote their music, or people have to promote their own work. I don't know if that's a pro or a con. Could be a pro because you get to control how you're advertising your work to the world. But from what I've heard, a lot of artists get annoyed at the whole self-promotion aspect. They just want to create. They don't want to have to do any sort of self-promotion. And sometimes self-promotion does feel a bit silly because you have to play into trends, TikTok trends, and do things that you don't want to do just because they're trendy and popular, just to get people's attention. So I feel like a lot of artists don't like the self-promotion aspect. A benefit, however, is self-employment. A lot of artists can work for themselves. The next one is self-employment, which again is a pro and a con. It's a pro because, like I said, you don't need a corporation to validate you and you have more control over your art. However, a con would be you have to wear lots of hats and you have to be your own marketer and your own accountant and your own PR rep and your own editor or whatever. You have to take on all those roles. Whereas when you're an artist, you just want to create your art. You don't want to do all this extra silly stuff that you don't know how to do or want to learn. But the downside of working for yourself, at the beginning at least, you have to take on those roles that you don't want to do. And then one more downside is that people are less willing to pay for art nowadays. Like I said, back in the day, you literally had to pay for any album you wanted to listen to. Now people are so used to getting things for free due to ads that people are less willing to pay for stuff or for content. And I get that because in the digital world, you're used to getting lots of information and content for free. When I'm using an app and then they're like, upgrade to paid, I'm like, how dare you? How dare you not give me this thing that you worked hard to make for free? But because I'm so used to getting things for free on the internet, that it almost feels like an offense when I'm asked to pay for something. So I wonder if that causes us to value art less now that we're not paying for it and it's so easily accessible. So yeah, just to summarize these general trends of how has being an artist changed with the advent of the internet. Content has become more short form because 1, it takes less time to make. 2, you can make more of it and get more likes per content or engagement per unit of content. Plus, it caters to the short attention spans that we have nowadays. 2, there's more diversity, or at least potential for diversity. Now there's less limits to who can enter a certain field than there used to be. So there is more potential for diversity. Whether that's actually being executed in reality, that's up for debate. It's definitely better than it used to be. It's getting there. It's improving. We'll give it that. There is more quantity And these are just general trends that I'm reporting, not good or bad, or whether they're good, positive or negative, that's up to your interpretation. But these are just general trends I'm noticing. So yeah, more quantity of content out there. Like, think of a comedian. Back in the day, they would have their comedy specials and they would go around and tour and then deliver their comedy special, and they would make a new one every year, every 2 years. And yes, famous comedians also do that now. However, to get famous, a very common way comedians get their work out there is through social media. And that requires them to put out regular content almost every day. YouTubers, podcasters can upload once a week, but if you're on TikTok, you have to upload more than once a week. So there's a really quick turnaround. You constantly have to produce more content. And back in the day, you had more time to work on your material. Because people were more willing to pay for art, you would get more money per unit, but you would also be producing less units as well. Another trend is that there's an element of globalization. So now art is not limited to a specific country the way it used to be. Each country would have their own popular things, and the way to know if something was really popular is if it got popular in other countries. That would be a huge deal. Nowadays, it wouldn't be such a huge deal if, let's say, I'm putting this on the internet right now, and if someone from New Zealand were watching this, it wouldn't be that crazy. You also have access to the internet, so do I. Okay, back in the day, if you're from America and someone from New Zealand was listening to your content, you would be like, whoa, I made it! People from the whole world know me! And things from one country can easily get popular in another country. For example, these past several years, K-pop has gotten really popular in the Western world. I don't see how that could have happened pre-internet, because how would you even be able to understand without translations and captions and lyrics? I don't even know how that would be able to be possible back in the day, because you need people to translate and provide captions so you can understand what's going on. But I think now with the internet, things don't have to be from your country or even in your language for you to appreciate them. If I was just curious, what is rock music in Norway like? I can find out in 1 second. Back in the day, if you were curious what Norwegian rock music sounded like, you would have to hope that your record store had something like that. And if they didn't, then you have to go to Norway, I guess. Another point I forgot to bring up in regards to the quantity thing is there is the paradox of choice. So when you have more options, you are actually less satisfied with the option you pick. And I definitely feel that, because every time I'm looking for something new to watch on Netflix, there's so many options, but it's oh, that looks kind of interesting, and that looks kind of interesting, and that looks kind of interesting, and I add 300 things to my list. So when I do pick something to watch, it's always I don't know, is this the most interesting thing I could watch? So if it doesn't entertain me in 15 minutes, I'll switch to something else. But it's what if that show became really interesting at the 16th minute, and I missed out on it because I didn't have the patience, because I thought there was something better out there. And you can see how this plays out with things like dating apps. Now people are less willing to put up with other people's flaws or annoying habits, because you get the illusion that there's so many more options out there. So when you feel there's a lot more options out there, you're less satisfied with the one that you end up picking. Another idea I had is in regards to the idea that there's more potential for diversity is that even while there's more potential for lots of different types of people to make art, mainstream music still all kind of sounds the same nowadays. And this might not be correct because, and again, this could just be my perception of it, because if I listen to, for example, a 90s hits playlist, I feel all the songs don't sound very similar to each other. There's a good diversity in sound. Whereas if I were to do today's hits playlist, all the songs sound kind of similar. But again, this could just be survivor bias. I mean, if you're listening to a 90s playlist, these are all songs that have to have stood the test of time for 30 years and to still be good after 30 years, or it wouldn't make the playlist. Whereas if you're listening to just a 2024 hits, the songs might not be as good of quality because they could just be one-hit wonders. Songs that are just popular this year and then everyone forgets about them. They haven't stood the test of time yet. So it could be possible that maybe the reason why we think older generation music sounds better is because the ones that we know of are the ones that ended up standing the test of time. That's also why we feel books were a lot better back then, because we read all these old classics and we're whoa, those are so good. Books back then used to be so much better. But really, these are just the ones that became popular, that stood the test of time. For every classic, there's 1,000 books that didn't become as famous. Or maybe there were books that were famous for a short amount of time, but weren't good enough to retain their popularity over a long amount of time. But that's another episode I have planned for another time, where I want to talk about why does music nowadays not sound as good as music of previous generations. Like, I feel like most people can agree that music from the 60s to the 90s was like the prime time for music. Like, that's when the best music was made. And I just like, music nowadays just is not as good. And it's not just my opinion, lots of people feel this way. So I wanted to kind of investigate more into like, why has music gotten worse, or has it gotten worse? Maybe there's another factor at play, but that's a different episode. I've gone on enough tangents today. So another trend that I wanted to take note of was that I feel like Gen Z has an interesting relationship with mainstream culture, because there seem to be a lot more subcultures now than there used to be. I mean, back in the day there was just like the goth, the theater kid, the preppy kid, the jock. You know, just like the few archetypes, and you had to fit into one of those. Nowadays there's like a tomato girl, a clean girl, a pink Pilates princess, a cottagecore girl. Okay, like what is a tomato girl? What is that trend? How is that even a thing? Like what is even associated with that? What does it mean to be part of that subculture? So I feel like maybe back in the day there were some people who fit into most people would be mainstream, but then a few people would fit into these few subcultures. Nowadays I feel like there is no like mainstream culture. I feel like everyone has created their own sort of niche or aesthetic or subculture out of everything. So maybe that's why mainstream music all kind of sounds the same, because maybe us Gen Z doesn't really listen to mainstream music that much. Maybe it just exists to play in parties. The only place I hear mainstream music is like in a retail store. But when I look at all of my friends and everyone I know and what they listen to, they don't listen to mainstream music generally. They listen to their own specific music taste that they've curated over the years. And this is also something I want to examine in another episode. I know, like, when I was writing the outline for this, I just got so many episode ideas while I was writing this. But this is something else I want to examine, is this whole idea of the mainstream and all these subcultures. Like, what did subcultures used to be like back in the day? And what is it now? I'm very interested in alternative culture. Like, what does it mean to be in the mainstream, and what does it mean to be outside of it? And why are there so many more subcultures now than there used to be? Like, does Gen Z have some sort of like identity problem? But that's a different episode. So subscribe if you want to hear all these episodes in the future. And one last trend I wanted to point out was about how art is not just for the rich. Asterisk. There's an asterisk. Yes, of course, rich people are able to engage in art more. I mean, if you're working two jobs, you probably don't have the time to like go to a museum and appreciate a painting or something. But generally, art is more democratized. You can't afford to go to art school, at least you can start an Instagram where you upload your art, and then maybe that will create some opportunities for you. I think a lot of people are realizing how many opportunities and how much social media can help with career growth and advancement. You don't need a fancy degree anymore. Or you don't need to work at some fancy corporation. You can just kind of create your own thing. Of course, one question that does lead to is, because people aren't paying for art in the same way that they used to, do we value it less? When you pay for something, it shows that you value it. And when you get it for free, you don't value it as much. Additionally, because there's so much content out there that's widely available to everyone, there's this immense amount of supply. So if there's more supply, does that mean there's less demand? How does that work? Because I feel like there's more supply, but there's also more demand as well. Maybe there's more supply because there was more demand that caused more supply, but now there's a lot of supply, so does that mean demand is going to go down? How does it work? How do the laws of economics apply to the digital world? Question mark. I don't know. I don't have the answers. Do intangible products fit the same rules of economics that tangible products do? I don't know. I do feel like at some point we're going to be very fatigued by the massive amounts of content out there. And I'm already starting to see a small shift in people preferring analog things. Like reading has come back. And I see people using wired headphones and taking pictures with like physical cameras. And I think we're all just craving like the simplicity that comes with having analog tools instead of digital tools. So yeah, we'll see how this relationship between quantity and quality and supply and demand play out. Because this is still a very new thing, and we haven't seen how it's going to truly play out. I heard somewhere that economists predicted that in 2026 there's going to be this thing called a great exhaustion, where people are just going to be so sick of being on their phones all the time that they're just going to be like, I'm done with this. I hope that happens. I really, really, really do. I think we need it. I'm very worried about how the world is going to go. Just stop innovating technology. Just stop it. We don't need more. This is enough. Just stop it. I know that's not going to happen. Anyways, another point I wanted to make regarding subcultures. Why can't I say my thoughts in a linear manner? This has just been all over the place. But tying back to subcultures, I do wonder, and I can elaborate more on this in the episode that I will make on subcultures. How does that impact our sense of community? Because on one hand, there's so many niche subcultures that I feel like we might not relate as much to someone who's not in your subculture, but at the same time, you will also relate even deeper with the people who are in your subculture because you have more in common with them. So does this lead to more community or less community? I feel like pre-internet, because there wasn't this vast amount of content that everyone could access, everyone was kind of consuming the same content. Everyone was listening to the same-ish music, the same TV shows, watching the same movies, reading the same books, because that's all there was out there. It would be hard to discover something that the people around you don't really know. But nowadays, I can find some really niche music and some really niche shows and read some really niche books that no one knows. And then I'll have nothing in common with anyone because what I consume is different from what everyone else consumes. So that would create less community because now I have less in common with other people. But then if I find someone who is into all those same niche stuff that I am, then I'll feel extra close and extra connected with them because we have this very unique thing in common. So I feel like maybe the sense of community is less centralized and more dispersed. But I can cover that later in the subculture episode. So stay tuned for that. So now we've gone over some trends of how art and the perception of art and being an artist has changed over time. But what are the similarities? I'm sure there are some similarities, right? And I've just jotted a few down. There's still suffering in the world. And as long as there's suffering, there's inspiration for a lot of the grunge era music was inspired by a lot of the tumultuous upbringing of Gen X, like the Reagan administration, and the fact that a lot of them had divorced parents and were latchkey kids, and all these other factors that involved in their suffering. The great thing about being a human is that there's no shortage of suffering. So there's always inspiration. For our generation's challenges is a bit different, but Gen Z, we have experienced a world that no one else in human history has ever experienced. We can create the most unique and special art because we have the most unique and special perspectives that not even older generations understand. Not even millennials. And millennials are still grew up with the internet. I mean, not in the same extent that we did. Millennials have still been influenced by the internet, but we grew up with it since we were kids. This is something different. No other generation has had technology from this young an age as we have. And that has given us some unique perspectives, and we can create some really unique art. And a lot of us Gen Z are still pretty young. We're still like in school or just barely entering the workforce, so we haven't seen any Gen Z made TV shows or movies. And there is some Gen Z music out there, but Gen Z is just starting to put their art out there. So I'm really curious what our cultural identity is going to be. What is our art going to be like? What is our TV shows going to be like? What are our songs like? I'm really curious what Gen Z art is like because no one outside of our generation can relate to our specific experience of the world. So while previous generations have gone through a specific type of suffering, like sure, Gen Z can't relate to growing up in the Reagan and Nixon administration, but we grew up with Trump as president, which is a whole nother can of worms. Suffering can lead to art. Another similarity is that being an artist has always been unstable. It was unstable then, it's unstable now. Well, yes, now there's a lower barrier for entry for art. Anyone can become an artist, but that doesn't mean anyone can make it as an artist. It's still, I don't know if it's just as hard, but it's still really, really hard to make it as an artist, to be famous, to be reputed, to be well-known, to make a living. How many people are able to make a living as an artist? That is incredibly rare now, and it was incredibly rare then. Most people who are artists have a lot of instability, both financially and also career-wise. Like, they don't have a steady influx of work coming in. Sometimes they'll have months where they have a lot of stuff to do, and then they'll have months where they don't have much to do. So being an artist has always been unstable, and it'll probably continue to be that way because art is something that will always be devalued because it's not a life or death thing. Like, you need doctors or people will die. If you don't have art, I feel like people will also die because they'll be so bored with their life that they won't want to live, but they won't directly die from it. Art is something that will always be devalued because it doesn't feel like as much of a necessity to a lot of people. Even though it's everywhere. Art is everywhere. You can't avoid it. I think art being devalued and being unstable and being hard to make a living from is a trend that's always going to continue. Another thing of similarity about art is it's not just about what you know, it's about who you know. Having the right connections with everything and when you're an artist. For example, if you're be a doctor or a lawyer, all you have to do is study and get good grades, and then it kind of works out. If you want to be a lawyer, all you have to do is study and get into law school, and then do well in law school and get a good job. And that's it. Whereas, so if you just follow those rules, you probably will make good money and be pretty successful. Whereas if you want to make it as an actress, you have to know the right people. Networking is a huge part of art-related industries. And that leads to my next point, which is hard work and talent don't necessarily equate to success. Then, if you want to be a doctor or a lawyer, you just have to study and follow all the rules, and you'll make it. And I know I say just as if it's easy. It's not easy. Of course, it's a lot of studying and hard work, but at least it's stable. If you know that if you follow these rules, you will make it. Whereas if you're an artist, you could be the best actress in the world, but if you don't rub shoulders with the right producer, you may never get a role. Or you could get a role and then be a one-hit wonder and everyone forgets you. Or you could get a role but then be typecast in one sort of thing. Or there's so many complications when it comes to art-related industries. And just being talented and hardworking and being good at your craft is not enough to be successful. You have to have that plus more. And sometimes people who aren't even good become famous because they're good looking or charismatic or whatever other reason. And that's a trend that has been there in the past pre-internet and is a trend that still continues to exist. And another trend which, like I said, while art has become more democratized and is not just for the rich, to the extent that it used to be, I still feel like art does favor people who have more money to some extent. Because, like I said, there's not much stability in it. So it's harder to pursue art when you don't have a safety net to fall back on. If you don't have a safety net, you can't take that risk. You need a stable job. But the people who can take that risk are people who usually do have safety nets. So while I feel like it's gotten a lot more evened out over the years, I feel like there is still a discrepancy. And like I said, because art will always be unstable, art will also always be in favor of the rich. Because the rich are the only people who can take those risks, those financial risks. So now, finally, the conclusion. I never thought this moment would come. I've been talking for an hour and a half, and the sun is setting, and it's so hot here in California, and I've been sitting on the floor, but now I'm finally here. And those of you who have made it this far, I really am impressed by your patience and tenacity, because I have not been able to stick to the topic. I wrote a whole outline, and still somehow my thoughts were disorganized. But okay, conclusion. It started with me going over some of the things that Charles R. Cross was saying about the influences in Kurt's environment that led to his artistic sensibility. And then I was challenging, are these things that are specific to his time period and his environment, or are they things that anyone can experience? And then that led to me thinking, how is it different to be an artist now than it was back in the day pre-internet, like the 80s and 90s? Is it easier? Is it harder? Is it better? Is it worse? And that leads to the question, how has being an artist changed over time? I can't definitively say whether it's easier or harder or better or worse, because these things are so complex and there's a lot of factors that play into it. And it also depends on what you personally value. I don't know what myself, because I feel like so many things are better, but so many things are worse. Like he says, as I already read, Kurt suffered years of bitter struggle, but in the end, these trials were essential to his artistry. And I agree, I do think suffering makes better art, and a lot of people might disagree with me on that. And I'd love to know why, because this might be a controversial opinion, but I think it's the most funny, interesting, creative people are the ones who have gone through something traumatic. Because if you go through something traumatic, your brain literally rewires itself to cope with that trauma. And because your brain has rewired itself, you also have new perspectives and takes on everything, which can lead to you being more creative and thinking out of the box, because you've gone through something no one else has gone through, or very few people have gone through. So you're going to have new perspectives that the average person wouldn't have. And when you think about all the greatest artists of all time, pretty much most of them have gone through something traumatic. Most of them have gone through some profound suffering. So yeah, that leads to an interesting question. Like, does good art require suffering? Me, personally, I think it helps. I can't say require, because yes, there have been good art. Okay, what is good art? That's subjective. But there has been art that I've appreciated that have been made by happy, normal people, but most of it hasn't. Most of my favorite art has been made by people who've suffered. So maybe that's my personal preference. Maybe I'm biased, or maybe traumatized people make better art. And that's another topic I might want to make an episode about. The relationship between art and suffering. Does suffering make better art? Does it make you a better artist? Do you need to have suffered to have made better art? I know I've definitely been more creative during my times of suffering. And I notice it in other people too. But I know some people disagree with this notion as well. To bring it back to the point I was originally saying, what extent does your circumstances influence your art? Is it better to have more technology or less technology? Is it better to have suffered or to have had an easy life? Is it better to have had privilege, or is it better to not have had privilege? Having privilege can get you access to certain opportunities you wouldn't have otherwise been able to have, but then you also wouldn't have the suffering either. At the end of the day, the person is what makes the artist, and not the circumstances. The circumstances influence the artist, but the artist is still an artist, regardless of their circumstances. And I want to end this with a quote that Kurt Cobain said in an interview that he gave in 1993, where he said that his father would try to take credit for his fame and say like, oh, the only reason you were able to make such good art is because you grew up in such a small and oppressed town. And then Kurt was like, no, it's not the town I grew up in that made the art. Like, I was the one who made the art. In fact, if I had grown up in a bigger city, I might have been exposed to punk rock even sooner, and I could have started it at a younger age. So again, that leads to the question, was he able to make good art because of his environment or in spite of it? So at the end of the day, this point, what he said in that interview basically goes back to the idea that it's really the artist who matters. It doesn't matter what kind of environment you have, what kind of upbringing you have, what your experiences are. Yes, I said that you have to have suffered to make good art. That's my opinion, and I could be wrong. But if you haven't suffered, that shouldn't stop you from thinking that you are capable of making good art. If you think your art is not unique or interesting because you haven't gone through something traumatic, maybe that's a limiting belief that's stopping you from making good art. And yes, I do have this opinion that art from suffering is better, but I could be wrong, and I would love to be proven wrong. At the end of the day, it's the person that's the artist, not the environment. It doesn't matter that you grew up in an internet age and you've been influenced by all this media. It doesn't matter if you grew up in a time before the internet. It doesn't matter what kind of environment you grew up in. If you're an artist, you'll always be an artist. And your environment influences your art for sure. But if you are capable of making good art, you will do that regardless. If there's a creative project that you're putting off, I implore you to go and work on it right now, or else. So anyways, all I have for you today, this was a long episode, right? But if you made it to the end, thank you for listening to my convoluted thoughts. As I get used to doing this, hopefully it'll follow more organized structure. Or not, we'll see. But if you're interested in this kind of topic, I'm interested in talking a lot about 90s music, alternative music, and what it means to be an artist and a musician. Then stick around for more, because I have some pretty cool episodes coming. And I really, really love this book. It is without a doubt the best Kurt Cobain biography out there. And I have read multiple and most of them are mediocre, and some of them are bad. And I've read this twice, and now I'm reading it a third time. Okay, thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you next week.